Siddhārtha Gautama, nowadays known as the Buddha, was an elitist par excellence. He was born as the son of the Raja, which in this case does not strictly mean the king, but the president for life of the Shakya Republic. So there they elected a king who remained king for life, but then he was not automatically succeeded by his son, and they had to have a new election. Though the Buddha had a good chance of being elected as the successor, because he was very politically savvy, he had a princely upbringing, he knew politics from, the cradle onwards. Since his 20, he served as a senator in the assembly of the Shakya tribe. Throughout his life, which he spent mostly as a monk, nevertheless, he was consulted for political advice. You see, some of these neighboring princes would maybe occasionally be interested in his spiritual opinion, but what they really wanted him for was his political advice. Contrary to a newfangled myth, the Buddha did not believe in equality between the sexes. Or even in what is nowadays called gender equality. Like, for example, he would, among the tests he performed on candidates for becoming a monk, he would ask, "Are you a man?" Because he didn't want women there. He also didn't want eunuchs there. They also exist in India. So, principles of the third sex and so on have no place in Buddhism. So women, of course, are not welcome at all. Initially, he refuses to recruit women in his monastic order, saying that this would shorten the lifespan of the order by 500 years. This is not simply to be ascribed to the spirit of the times. At the same time, another ascetic is active as a sect leader, namely Mahavira Jina. Now, in Jainism, you have plenty of women ascetics. They have a very central, important place there. So the Buddha didn't like it, yet at some point his foster mother, you see, his mother died when he was born, so he was raised by a foster mother. Now, when she's getting older, she wants to become a nun. And then the Buddha relents, which is another form of inequality. The Buddha is a nepotist. He allows his family more than others. So when other women want to be ordained, he refuses. When his foster mother does, then he accepts. In the Lalita Vistara, the German scholar Edmund Weber quotes, "The standpoint which caste a Buddha should belong to has not been revised in Buddhism up to the present day. It is dogmatized in the Lalita Vistara in the following way: a bodhisattva can by no means come from a lower or even a mixed caste. Quote, after all bodhisattvas were not born in a despised lineage, among pariahs, in families of pipe makers or cart makers, or mixed castes. Instead, in perfect harmony with the Great Sermon, it was said that, quote, the bodhisattvas appear only in two kinds of lineage, the one of the brahmanas and the one of the warriors, the kshatriyas. Yeah. The very mildly casteist society at the time of the Buddha, or the fiercely casteist society 1,000 years later. You see, they never go against it. Like, for example, the Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, in his edicts, sometimes goes diametrically against the existing customs. For instance, he prohibits animal sacrifice in certain ways. He was not afraid to go against popular opinion, yet in all his descriptions he never goes against the caste system. So usually they simply accept the mores of the people. Only some young men are recruited into the Buddhist order, and for them, of course, the full weight of Buddhist norms counts. But otherwise they don't meddle in society. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to talk about the egalitarian claims nowadays made for Buddhism. Siddhārtha Gautama, nowadays known as the Buddha, was an elitist par excellence. He was born as the son of the Raja, which in this case does not strictly mean the king, but the president for life of the Shakya Republic. So there they elected a king who remained king for life, but then he was not automatically succeeded by his son, and they had to have a new election. Though the Buddha had a good chance of being elected as the successor, because he was very politically savvy, he had a princely upbringing, he knew politics from, the cradle onwards. Since his 20, he served as a senator in the assembly of the Shakya tribe. Throughout his life, which he spent mostly as a monk, nevertheless, he was consulted for political advice. You see, some of these neighboring princes would maybe occasionally be interested in his spiritual opinion, but what they really wanted him for was his political advice. You see, he knew politics through and through, yet at the same time, by becoming a monk, he was not partisan anymore. So his advice was not subtly mixed with personal calculations of his own interest. He fulfilled the prediction at his birth of becoming either a great ruler or a great sage. These republics, so the Shakya Republic is one of many, so that this was an established practice in Indian republics. So they had elective kingship, so they had some kind of monarchical rule, but not absolutely so. The king was elected by the people, and then again, the people means not the people in general, it actually means the ruling class, the Kshatriyas. This is an Indo-European institution that you find back among other Indo-European peoples, like in the Holy Roman Empire, which mostly equals Germany. In the Middle Ages, you had a system of 7 electors, or Kurfürsten in German, that chose from among themselves one who would serve as the emperor. Then when the emperor died, those 7 would again rule choose the next one, who could be from a different family. So that's the system that the Buddha had grown up in. That's also what he will use, mutatis mutandis, for his own Sangha. So of course, it's not full equality in the modern sense. There are remainders of aristocracy. There is very importantly the principle of seniority. So a longer serving monk is automatically deemed superior to a newer monk. But among religion founders, he's perhaps the one who pays the most attention to a more or less representative system of rulership. The Buddha uses the term Ārya quite a lot. Like, for instance, you have the Four Noble Truths, the Chattvari Ārya Satyani, or you have the Noble Eightfold Path, the Ārya Ashtangika Marga. Now, many people, Hindus as well as foreigners, translate this in a general psychological, ethical meaning of noble. So this means magnanimous, generous, well-educated, and so on. That's a character trait that is not strictly dependent on social class. Now, that's an extended metaphorical meaning of the word noble, both in English and in Sanskrit. So in English, noble originally means a member of the nobility. And only later it gets the larger metaphorical meaning of noble character. You hear the same. So I suggest that we first verify if it already had that extended meaning, because there are in fact indications that the Buddha uses it in the old sociological sense. At the Vedic stage, the word Ārya means a fellow tribesman, a compatriot. It means us as against them. The Vedic tribe is the Paurava tribe, so among Pauravas it means a fellow Paurava. In the Vedas, usually the word Ārya refers to a Paurava. When the Paurava for some reason ends up in the enemy camp, he's still called an Ārya. And by contrast, when a non-Paurava comes to the help of the Pauravas, like Mandhata, who belongs to the solar dynasty, he's still not called an Ārya. They may find him noble and all kinds of other virtues, but they don't call him an Ārya. An Ārya, that term is reserved for fellow tribesmen. Now, when the Vedic tradition overflows the ethnic boundary of the Paurava and starts getting adopted by neighboring tribes, then the word Ārya acquires the meaning of Vedic, of Paurava, in fact, of Paurava origin. And so this sense of Vedic still attaches to the word Ārya, best known example being the Ārya Samaj. Ārya Samaj should be translated as the Vedicist society. And they strongly absolutize the Vedas. So the Buddha's use of the term Ārya may indicate the idea of a return to the Vedas. You see, in his day, the Vedas have been completed more than 1,000 years before. So the Vedic corpus exists. It's like high in the sky. It's greatly venerated. It's being divinized. But so there are also people who try to profit from it. And so he has the impression that a certain priestly class is distorting the Vedas for their own interests, is trying to take hold of the Vedas. Now, it does not follow that he rejects the Vedas or that Buddhism is a revolt against the Vedas, as is said in most introductions today, as is said by politicians and agitators in India, no end. Indeed, he praises the Vedic rishis by name, but he denounces later distortions. So he's all for the Vedas. He is more critical of the class of people who treat the Vedas as their own. And he never exclaims that the existing religious order has to be overthrown or anything like that. So far from being a revolutionary, he appeals to what he calls the ancient way. He is treading the ancient way which the Buddhas of the past have also trodden. Now we're going to talk about the egalitarianism or otherwise in Buddhism. Now a very, very simple, straightforward form of inequality is that between the sexes. Contrary to a newfangled myth, the Buddha did not believe in equality between the sexes. Or even in what is nowadays called gender equality. Like, for example, he would, among the tests he performed on candidates for becoming a monk, he would ask, "Are you a man?" Because he didn't want women there. He also didn't want eunuchs there. They also exist in India. So, principles of the third sex and so on have no place in Buddhism. So women, of course, are not welcome at all. Initially, he refuses to recruit women in his monastic order, saying that this would shorten the lifespan of the order by 500 years. This is not simply to be ascribed to the spirit of the times. At the same time, another ascetic is active as a sect leader, namely Mahavira Jina. Now, in Jainism, you have plenty of women ascetics. They have a very central, important place there. So the Buddha didn't like it, yet at some point his foster mother, you see, his mother died when he was born, so he was raised by a foster mother. Now, when she's getting older, she wants to become a nun, and then the Buddha relents, which is another form of inequality. The Buddha is a nepotist. He allows his family more than others. So when other women want to be ordained, he refuses. When his foster mother does, then he accepts. And so she opens the gate for other women. However, he makes the institution of female monastics, of a nunnery, conditional. Even the most seasoned nun, even the eldest, the wisest, the most learned nun, has to be subordinate to even the dullest, junior-most monk. And indeed, I recently read some interview with nuns in Myanmar, and they totally interiorized this. They said, yeah, but you see, being a man is very superior. And indeed, you see, that's also how men think about it. I know of several cases where Buddhist monks had a woman to thank, to thank for some service. And so they expressed their gratitude by saying, "Oh lady, in your next life, you're going to be rewarded. You're going to be a man." So this is totally obvious for them that men are superior to women. Maybe you can understand it from an ascetic viewpoint in the sense that being a man gives you more opportunity to practice asceticism. So women are more vulnerable. They can easily be caught into a family situation where they have the responsibility for bringing up children, which is a pretty full-time business. And so to combine that with a sadhana is rather difficult. So in that sense, being a man is easier. Although in the Jain vision, it's the reverse. You see, men proverbially are running behind wherever their organ points them to. Whereas women, not that they are not sensual and so on, but less so than men. It preoccupies them less. So in that sense, women are more endowed for asceticism than men. Some Theravada countries, southern Buddhism, they have even re-abolished the women's order. In countries like Sri Lanka or Thailand, nunneries have disappeared over the centuries. It's only now that they're being revived, mainly under Western feminist influence. So you see, the position of women in Buddhism is a bit problematic. Okay, now let's go to the caste story. So when the Varna system took shape, and this is more or less in the time of the Buddha. You see, in the time of, let's say, Vedavyasa, you have no caste system yet. In the Ramayana, you see Rāma fraternizing with tribals, no question about purity being heard and so on. It's only in the later interpolation of the 7th book, the last book, the Uttarakanda, that suddenly casteism appears, and totally incongruous with the rest of the epic. Similarly, in the Mahabharata, you see the Mahabharata was written over more than 1,000 years. And so in the old core story, you find some caste elements being interpolated 1,000 years later. Like Draupadi doesn't want to consider Karna as a candidate for wedding because he's thought to be of lower caste. So that's probably not an original element, but interpolated later. Anyway, so the caste system keeps on growing. So by the time of the Buddha, there are indications that at least among the upper crust, a certain caste consciousness is entering. Then it'll take till after the time of Christ, according to geneticists, to find Hindu society really being divided in box-type castes. So it takes time before this idea of caste, of endogamy, takes root among the general population. But among the aristocracy, it was already starting. The word Ārya in the Buddha's time clearly, mostly still has a sociological meaning. It means the elite, it means upper class. We'll come to see a few evidences of this. This is not to deny that there exists a Buddhist polemic against caste, but mainly much later. By the time of Dharmakirti, the Buddhist philosopher, more than 1,000 years after the Buddha himself, then the caste system is fully developed, and he indeed polemicizes against it, which is easy for him to do as a monk, because monks don't have anything to do that brings caste with it. You see, if you are a social person and you have to, fraternize, if you have, for instance, business dinners with other people, then you have to consider, do I have dinner together with people of a different caste? Doesn't this hurt my caste purity? Or especially, very especially, if I have to marry off my daughter, what candidate is fit? Doesn't he have to be of my own caste? Now, as a monk, you don't have any of these worries. So there it is easy to say, oh, no caste. Well, at any rate, you see, whatever the reason, Dharmakirti certainly does polemicize against caste, as the Buddha does not do. And even then, you see, at the time of Dharmakirti, there is no abolitionism. He doesn't try to abolish caste. And indeed, you see, for monks, this is just not done. They don't meddle in society. They don't tell non-monks what to do. Just like in other countries, they adapt to whichever social order exists there. They don't try to change it. So what about the Buddha himself? Here is a quotation which I borrow from Luis Gomez. So he cites from the Mahavibhasa. The Buddha said, what the noble ones say is the truth. What the others say is not true. And why is this? The noble ones understand things as they are. The common folk do not understand. Furthermore, they are called noble truths because they are possessed by those who own the wealth and the assets of the noble ones. Furthermore, no, this is the same thing. Okay, but so he clearly articulates that the noble class, the nobility class, has certain virtues that the commoners don't have. In the Lalita Vistara, the German scholar Edmund Weber quotes, the standpoint which caste a Buddha should belong to has not been revised in Buddhism up to the present day. It is dogmatized in the Lalita Vistara in the following way. A bodhisattva can by no means come from a lower or even a mixed caste. Quote, after all bodhisattvas were not born in a despised lineage, among pariahs, in families of pipe makers or cart makers, or mixed castes. Instead, in perfect harmony with the great sermon, it was said that, quote, the bodhisattvas appear only in two kinds of lineage, the one of the brahmanas and the one of the warriors, the kshatriyas. So as an application of this choice for the upper castes, the Buddha prophesies about his own successor, about the next Buddha, the Maitreya, that he is going to be born in a Brahman family. Then when the Buddha dies, that's 45 years after his enlightenment, after the start of his monastic order. In a Buddhist context par excellence, when his own followers, who certainly know more or less the contents of Buddhism, and they speak to fellow Buddhists, okay? So if it had been anti-caste, this was an occasion when they would avoid using caste discourse. Even if that's what they had in mind, they wouldn't say it. And yet they say, oh, we have a right to his ashes. We want to build a stupa around his ashes. Why? He was a kshatriya. We are kshatriyas. So we are entitled to his ashes. So after absorbing his teachings for 45 years, they feel no compunction at all about expressing themselves in caste terms. So I think that the shift from a literal sociological meaning of Ārya to a metaphorical moral meaning of magnanimous, generous, and so on, was certainly not complete at the time. Ārya still means upper class. A word that frequently returns in the Buddha's discourses is nobly born. For instance, in the 7 rules of non-decline, the Sapta-shila, there is one in which he favors protecting women, but you see, he says protecting nobly born women. If a maidservant gets raped, well, I wouldn't say that that's Buddhist, but that's not so much of a concern. A nobly born woman par excellence, now that's more serious. So he makes this distinction, this class distinction. Then the Buddhists, in their writings about the Buddha, are very proud about his birth. They clearly set great store by this. So they emphasize that he's a direct descendant of Manu. Manu, the patriarch, the one with whom the whole Vedic and solar dynasty history starts. as also his kinship with Rāma, who is part of the same solar dynasty. So birth is very important to the Buddhists after him. Like, for instance, what fits this is the repeated description of birthmarks that somehow are deemed typical for a being who's going to be enlightened. Like he has long earlobes, for example. So about Rāma and about Viṣṇu, of whom Rāma is supposed to be an incarnation, Buddhist scripture makes much of the Buddha's noble birth in the solar lineage. And one of the most famous exemplars of the solar lineage is Rāma. So he claims not only to be a relative or even a descendant of Rāma, he also claims to be a reincarnation of Rāma. So in the Buddhist retelling of the Ramayana, which forms part of the Jatakas, that's the claim he himself makes. Now, of course, these Jatakas were actually put into writing centuries after the Buddha. Even the earliest writings of the Pali canon is already 3 centuries younger than the Buddha, so who knows what may have crept in. But at any rate, that's what the literature says, that the Buddha himself claimed to be Rāma. He also likens himself to the mightily striding Viṣṇu. And so, when later Hindus, centuries later, it was not there in the Ramayana, but when centuries later they reinterpret Rāma as a descent, an avatara of Viṣṇu, then it's perfectly logical that the reincarnation of Rāma, namely the Buddha, is taken along in this process, that the Buddha is also seen as an incarnation of Viṣṇu. That is not something which wily Brahmins have invented and have tried to impose because of what the secularists call assimilative communalism. You know, here in this case, trying to grab Buddhism and put it inside Hinduism. No, you see, that was the Buddha's own doing. In 1956, before that it was never a problem, but in 1956, when B.R. Ambedkar converts to Buddhism, and mind you, this is the very first conversion to Buddhism ever. You see, conversion is a Christian concept. And the idea behind conversion is that you burn your bridges with your former religion. When King Clovis of Paris, after whom all the French kings are named Louis. Louis is the French version of Clovis. So when in 1496 he converts from Germanic paganism to Catholicism, his baptism father tells him, now burn what you worshipped. You see, that is the Christian idea of conversion. You break completely with every other religion, you become 100% Christian. Okay, now, so this Ambedkar projects onto his acceptance of Buddhism. This becomes the first conversion to Buddhism, even though numerous people had accepted Buddhism, but that never meant a break with their Hinduism, Taoism, Shintoism, or whatever they were before. So he promises, and he also extracts from his followers the promise, that they will no longer see the Buddha as an avatar of Viṣṇu. In 1999, this is around the time when I personally interviewed Jayendra Saraswati, the Kanchipuram Shankaracharya. Okay, so around that time, it was busy at his door because somebody else came by, the Vipassana teacher S.N. Goenka. And so he has done very good work in his life. He recently died. But so I myself have followed some of his Vipassana meditation retreats. Vipassana is the Sanskrit for what is now in English called mindfulness. So, he's a very, very productive Buddhist teacher. However, he was also a little bit of a fanatic and very wedded to the idea that Buddhism is a separate religion. So he extracted from the Kanchipuram Shankaracharya the promise, a completely one-sided promise. It's again very typical for Hindus, that they make compromises, which means that they themselves do a concession and the other party doesn't. Anyway, so the Shankaracharya promises that Hindus would give up considering the Buddha as an incarnation of Viṣṇu. Now, formally, he doesn't really have the power to do that. He doesn't command anything among Hindus, but okay, he's a figure with some authority, so that may have had some influence. At any rate, he acted on the presupposition that this was a Hindu imposition, whereas it was a contribution of the Buddha himself. There is also a theory that the Buddha was Iranian. Here we're going to talk about the ethnicity of the Buddha. So already his contemporaries saw him as tall and light-skinned, and even as blue-eyed. And so I think it's probably a real thing. You see, in India, blue-eyed people are very rare. You find them among some communities that came from Afghanistan, like the Chitpawan Brahmins. There I know some blue-eyed people. But so they came from outside India. And so in the Iranian belt, Central Asia, there you find some blue-eyed people. So here you see somehow this affects the Buddha also. Some scholars explain this by an Iranian ancestry. The Buddha would have been an Iranian. So his nation is called the Shakyas, which reminds us of a very similar word, the Shakas. The Shakas, or in English, the Scythians, who are the northern Iranians. You have the southern Iranians who have their own empire, and then you have the far more barbaric northern Iranians, the Shakas, the Sarmatians, the Dacians, and so on. And so the Buddha might have been one of them. And effectively, Iranians on average are taller and lighter skinned than the average Bihari, which is what the Buddha was. Then it's an interesting theory because it would explain the fierce endogamy that the Shakyas practiced. So they practiced cousin marriage, which is something still very common among Muslims. But so also other groups, the Dravidians also practiced it, which is interesting because some neo-Buddhists want to argue that the Buddha was a non-Aryan, was part of the pre-Aryan good guys who stood up against the ugly, vicious Aryan invaders. Okay, so they would have an interest in linking his endogamy with the Dravidian custom. And I haven't heard of that yet. But so it's linked with the Iranian custom of endogamy. Why? Well, you see, among Brahmins, it doesn't exist. They have rules, just like the Catholic Church has, against what they call prohibited degrees of consanguinity. So you cannot marry your cousin or your niece or your aunt, not even your second cousin. So there has to be a certain genetic distance between two spouses. Now, this is not the case here. The Buddha himself had only 4 great-grandparents. Normally you have 8. Because how is it exactly? The father of his paternal grandfather was the brother of his maternal grandmother, something like that. Anyway, it was all very, very endogamous, very inbred. So he was used to this endogamy, and the Shakyas explained this endogamy as a consequence of their pride in their ancestry. They were descendants from Manu himself, and they wanted to keep that blood pure. Now, there is a possibility, that's what these Iranian type scholars say, that this was only some explanation afterwards, something that sounded good to their Hindu neighbors, but that in fact had to cover up the Iranian origin of their practice of endogamy. I don't know, I give it for what it is worth. At any rate, wherever Buddhism went, it accepted the local social order. So it may be Chinese imperial centralistic bureaucracy, or it may be Japanese militaristic feudalism, or in Indonesia it may be the tribal society, or whatever. And indeed, the caste society in India. The very mildly casteist society at the time of the Buddha, or the fiercely casteist society 1,000 years later. You see, they never go against this. Like, for example, the Buddhist emperor Ashoka, in his edicts, sometimes goes diametrically against the existing customs. For instance, he prohibits animal sacrifice on certain days. He was not afraid to go against popular opinion, yet in all his descriptions, he never goes against the caste system. So usually they simply accept the mores of the people. Only some young men are recruited into the Buddhist order, and for them, of course, the full weight of Buddhist norms counts. But otherwise, they don't meddle in society. I know of only one exception, and it's an interesting one. You see, some Hindus have a complex, they get defensive when Catholic missionaries say, you have sati, self-immolation of widows. Now, in fact, only a few castes among Hindus have that. And it's not typically Hindu. So it has existed in ancient Egypt, in ancient China, and here among the Mongols. Now, the Mongols turned to Tibetan Buddhism, and the third Dalai Lama was a friend of the leaders of the Mongols, and he managed to have sati, here not in the form of widow burning, but widow burial. They were buried alive, okay? He managed to get that abolished. That's one case of Buddhist interference in society. But so it's very exceptional. The Buddha pursued liberation, nirvana. So he did not pursue a just society or any form of social reform, which was a distraction. You see, if you do things that he didn't want, like getting married, nothing exceptional, you see, you attract quite a burden of duties. You have to sort of please your wife, you have your family to look after, children have to be brought up, they have to be married off, and so on. There's all kinds of duties in order to lighten your burden so that you can concentrate on your sadhana. He advises you not to start a family and instead to join the monastic order. Now, if you pursue worldly ambitions, like getting married, like bringing up children, very often you're still going to be a big failure. Maybe you don't make your wife happy, you get divorced or whatever. Your children may be handicapped, or they may die in the war, or you may get them married, but it's a bad marriage, and all kinds of misery ensues and so on. However, some people succeed. So you see, if you try to make a success of your life, well, there's a chance that you succeed. You see, you may have a very good life. Rarely, but some people manage this. But this already takes a big effort. It leaves very little time for your sadhana. Now, if you want to change society, that's an even bigger effort. You see, making your own life a success already requires an investment, but changing society requires a much larger investment. So it is very contrary to the pursuit of liberation that he advocates. Meantime, it did not take much of his time to advise political leaders about their situation. So, you see, he was one of the political leaders. They knew him. He was from a royal family, and he had some experience, and you see, he could observe everything they did, only he was no longer one of them. He was neutral, so he was far more reliable than the others. They also knew him because they financed his order. You see, this is an aspect that few people look at. And it's the same in all religions, like, for instance, where did the money of Jesus come from? Well, it is said in the Gospel, in a passage that practically nobody knows about, that there were several rich women who financed him, and they're mentioned by name. So in this case also, or for instance, in the case of Muhammad, he financed himself by raids. He plundered caravans. And so here, well, he lives by begging, but in his case, a rather upper class form of begging. Namely, he attracts sponsorship from his fellow princes. And so when he wants to set up a monastery somewhere, well, he approaches the local king and he says, I want to have a monastery built. So the local king, you see, he extracts taxes from his people. From the merchants, he extracts money. From the peasants, the craftsmen, they don't have money, but they have their working power. So he has them work like 1 month every year or so for him. And so he tells them, okay, now you go build this monastery for my friend the Buddha. This is my way of showing my piety. I have my people build a monastery for him. So by the time the Buddha dies, he has this pan-Indian network of monasteries that his fellow monastics and sect leaders could only dream of. That's one factor of the success of Buddhism that is practically never mentioned, but it's there to really understand the career of Buddhism. So you see, sometimes when he advises other princes about what to do politically, he gives a glimpse of his political views, which were good, interesting, sympathetic, but still fallibly human. So let's discuss his greatest failure. He had a friend called Prasenajit, who was the king of Kosala, the area of Ayodhya. He is married to a Shakya wife of his own tribe, the Shakyas. And they have a son. Now the son grows up when he's 16 or so. He discovers the truth about his descent. Namely that, he thinks that he's a Kshatriya. He's the son of the Kshatriya king. And he thinks his mother is also Kshatriya. But what turns out, the Shakyas, who are very proud of their pedigree, did not want to marry off one of their princesses to this interloper, the king of Kosala. Because even though the king of Kosala has become very powerful militarily, and so he's a neighbor whom they have to keep as friend, nevertheless, he's not a Shakya. And so they don't want to marry one of their daughters to him. However, the president for life of the Shakyas, who is then no longer the Buddha's father, the next person. But so, like many upper class man, he has some girlfriends on the side. So from a maid servant, he has a daughter. And that daughter is used as a stand-in to act as a Shakya princess to keep this prince from Kosala happy. Now, the son who is born from this union discovers the true story. So he knows now that his mother is not a Kshatriya. Now, the Buddha is consulted about this and he says, well, there's not really any problem. You see, of this young prince, at least the father is a Kshatriya, so he is a Kshatriya. He's perfectly entitled to the throne. But the young prince doesn't think so. He says, no, endogamy. Both parents have to be from the same caste. So here you see that at that time, during the Buddha's life, the balance is shifting from purely patrilineal caste to endogamy caste. And so the Buddha is an old man at that time, 78, he's still brought up in the old system. The prince represents the new system. So caste is becoming more edgy, more consequential. Soon after this, Prince Virudaka commits a coup d'etat against his father. Now he is in control of the army. Now he's in a position to take revenge upon the Shakyas. And he does. So he organizes the massacre of the Shakyas, the Shakya Hatya. And so initially the Buddha manages to dissuade him, but finally he doesn't. So the massacre takes place. And all that the Buddha now can do, while the massacre is going on, is to explain to his monks why this is happening. So he uses it as an illustration for the karma theory. So he explains that this was karmically necessary as a punishment for those who are now the Shakyas, and as a revenge for those who are now the soldiers. Because in a past life. So the Buddha is reduced to explaining what has happened. So he uses it as an illustration for the karma theory. So he says, okay, what is happening now is the due punishment for villagers in a past life. So when Virudaka commits the massacre of the Shakyas, the so-called Shakya Hatya, the Buddha is reduced to explaining to his monks why all this is happening. So he explains that in a past life, the present-day Shakyas were the villagers in a village during the dry season. And so the mighty river of winter time had shrunk to a small rivulet, and many fish in the river were caught on the dry. And they begged the villagers, please throw us in what little water remains. But the villagers laughed at them. Indeed, the Buddha was a young lad at the time. He had a stick in his hands. And what did he do? He beat the fish on the head. That is why, explains the Buddha, I now have a headache. It's my karmic comeuppance for beating them on the head. But, of course, I am not just anyone. I am the Buddha. That's why I only have a headache. Whereas all these others, they are getting the full measure of their punishment. So they are being killed. And by whom are they being killed? Well, by the fish at that time who are now taking their revenge. They are now reincarnated as the soldiers. So, you see, this is the classical karma theory. There is a more subtle karma theory, which some people associate with Buddhism, but in fact here you see the Buddha really explaining the vulgar karma theory of reward and punishment. There is a more subtle theory, which is that in the next life you fulfill the desires of this life. Like you have a good example in the Mahabharata, where Amba, the sister of Ambika and Ambalika, who are the mothers of Dhritarashtra and Pandu, Okay, so Amba, she is in love with this Prince Shalya, and they're going to get married and so on. But unfortunately, Shalya runs into Bhishma, and they have a fight, and Shalya is defeated. Now it's not serious; he's not dead or anything, and she still wants to marry him, but he feels that he's dishonored, and so he doesn't want to marry her anymore. He loves her, she loves him, yet a marriage has become impossible. So she's very angry with Bhishma, and she wants to take revenge on Bhishma. But what can she do, being only a poor, weak woman? Okay, so she decides to fast unto death and to get reborn in a position where she can take revenge. So she comes back as a soldier. Shikandhin, who hides behind Arjuna during the battle, and Arjuna, of course, has this curse that he can't kill Bhishma, but from behind Arjuna's shoulder, Shikandhin shoots an arrow and kills Bhishma. So this is how a desire from one life is fulfilled in the next life. That's also a form of karma. And indeed, that is the more subtle karma theory, the non-retributive karma theory that underlies Buddhism. You see, the theory in Buddhism is that you are tied to the wheel of reincarnations by your desire. So if you die and your desires have not been quenched, you still have a desire, or a negative desire, fear. So if you're not neutral to the world, then that stimulates you to get reborn. And that determines the contents of your next life. So if you die with a desire to take revenge on Bhishma, then you're going to be reborn in a situation of revenge on Bhishma. And so more generally, the contents of your past life determine the contents of this life. That, incidentally, is also more or less the picture sketched by modern reincarnation researchers, like Ian Stevenson, or like the two I've personally known, Erlendur Haraldsson from Iceland and Hans ten Dam from the Netherlands. So in their report on testimonies, particularly by young children, of past lives, you don't find the vulgar karma theory of reward and punishment. Nevertheless, you do find that past lives have an influence on the present life, namely in this form that I just sketched. You see, some desires unfulfilled in a past life get fulfilled in the next life. So, and in fact, you see in the sequel of the story, that could be cited as an example. Because the soldiers, after killing the Shakyas, go home. And it takes several days. So they camp out on the riverside to spend the night. But that night, the dry season ends. The rainy season begins, and the river overflows, and they all get drowned. Now, that's karma, because in their past life, when they were the fish, they were begging, please throw us in the water. Well, and now they are in the water. See, anyway, so you see, it's a failure in the sense that he has his whole people killed, massacred, and there's nothing he can do about it. And then another failure, here again you see that the Buddha is just a human being. And it says a lot about his political views. So this is in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra in Sanskrit, or in the Satta Apariyaniya Dhamma in Pali. Maybe that Mahaparinirvana is the last days and the death of the Buddha. Satta Aparihaniya Dhamma means the 7 non-decrease duties. So this is about the 7 rules for non-decline, non-decrease. So if you want your state not to decline, you have to observe these several rules. That's what the Buddha says. You see, the Magadha Empire is very rich and successful, and they are annexing one neighboring state after another. But they find that they don't succeed in annexing the Vṛjji Republic. So the Prime Minister of Magadha, called Vācakara, approaches the Buddha to ask him, what is the secret of their strength? And so the Buddha says, well, it so happens that I myself gave them several rules long ago. They're following these rules, and as long as they do, they are invincible. So he starts to explain what these several rules are. So the conversation with this Vācakara goes in the company of this favorite disciple of the Buddha, namely Ananda. And so the first rule is unity. And so Gautama the Buddha asks Ananda, Ananda, have you heard whether the Vṛjjis are united and stay united? Yes, Bhante, I have heard that the Vṛjjis are united and that the Vṛjjis stay united. So says the Buddha, so long as they are united and remain united, consider them to be prospering and far from decline. I won't repeat this formula in all the next cases, but so you see that this is a typical mnemotechnic device, to easily learn the story by heart. So the 6 other principles: decision making in mutual harmony. So they have to all together attend the assembly and positively participate. They have to follow Dharma. Then they have to respect the elders, the teachers, the wise, and so on. They have to respect women. So as it said here, among the Vṛjjis, the women and girls of good family are respected and are not considered of little worth. They are protected and treasured by their parents and brothers, husbands and in-laws, kinsmen and neighbors. They do not suffer kidnapping and abduction, bondage and confinement. The Vṛjji men do not lust after and seduce another's wife. See, that's one of the principles of non-decline. If you want to strengthen your society, this is how to do it. Then 6, you have to respect spiritual institutions. Sacred places in the city and outside are revered, venerated, respected. They don't abandon the time-established tradition to provide the support due to the chaityas, the sacred places. So you see, far from being a revolutionary, the Buddha is a conservative. He wants everything existing to be preserved. Then finally, you have to respect holy men. Okay, so the Vṛjjis respect all that, and as long as they keep doing it, you will not be able to defeat them. Now, Vācakara acts as if he is now dissuaded from trying to conquer the Vṛjji Republic. And so maybe he's lying when he says that, okay, I'll accept this as it is. At any rate, you could invoke this to defend the Buddha, because otherwise it would mean that the Buddha is an accomplice in a political conspiracy to overthrow the Vṛjji, which ultimately succeeds. So Vācakara observes all the diplomatic niceties, but then he goes home to pursue his task, which is to overthrow the Vṛjji Republic. Now he goes to the Magadha cabinet and he sets up a big riot where you see the talk is about, okay, how do we conquer the Vṛjjis? And he plays, that he is in favor of the Vṛjji and that they should not attack the Vṛjjis and so on. And he does it so dramatically that he's fired from the cabinet. And he makes sure this is widely publicized. So the Vṛjjis think, oh, this is our man. And they hire him as a minister of education. Now, we don't know exactly what he tells the students, but at any rate, through the students, he manages to influence their parents. There is a novel, a historical novel by Siddhārtha Gautama called Sapta Shila from 1960, in which he tries to imagine what exactly happens. At any rate, he can't alter the well-known ending, which is that Magadha comes in a position of conquering the Vṛjjis, namely because they abandoned seven rules. The assembly is no longer well attended. People are no longer participating in consultations, in unitary decision making. And so the Buddha meanwhile dies. A few years later, Magadha finds the situation sufficiently fit for conquest. They invade and annex the Vṛjji Republic. So in the life of the Buddha, this is a very small incident, but actually it teaches a lot about his political views. You see, he's into the harmony movement. With direct participatory democracy, of course it's not modern democracy, not everyone involved and so on, but still it's something totally different from autocracy. He believes in consensus and in a Confucius-like conservatism. Everybody has to jointly participate in the public culture and maintain it. So you have to fortify society not by repression, but by embedding it in a heartfelt care for its vulnerable and precious members and for the ancestral, which is largely Vedic, tradition. So this belies the modern Ambedkarite view of the Buddha as a revolutionary. So the Buddha paid little attention to society, but when he did not indulge in oppression talk or in class struggle, but in fact he favored harmony. He also did not care for structures, but for personal attitudes. He believed in collective decision-making, not so much by majority vote as in Western democracies ever since Athenian democracy, but by consensus. This may be a bit less practical, there's a lot longer talking, but then you all agree, and so the decision is very strong. There's no disgruntled minority that, will work against it. Now, okay, you see, this political system is advisable, it's desirable, it's fine, but does it make invincible? Is it the principle of non-decline? Now here you have to realistically say, this sounds like the Gandhian belief in soul force. You see, Gandhi also said, a satyagrahi cannot be defeated. Well, I don't know. You see, quite a few satyagrahis have been killed, that at least. So I don't think that soul force makes invincible. And so here also, I think these rules are very good, very desirable, but invincible, no. Moreover, that may be good, but goodness itself is very vulnerable. So you see, things may happen that may make this goodness go away. And indeed, that's precisely what Vāsakara banks on. See, he sort of connives, manipulates so that ultimately the loyalty to these 7 precepts withers away. So this system of goodness, of harmony and so on is certainly more desirable than an iron hand, but it's not all powerful. So, okay, let's conclude. You see, there's nothing in Buddhist history that justifies the modern romance of Buddhism as a movement for social everywhere it went, the Buddhists did not seek social reform, but accepted whatever system was in place. You see, their power to reform anything went as far as the monks they recruited. They, of course, were told to abide by Buddhist principles. So Buddhism didn't create the caste system. It was not more casteist than anything that went before, but also not less. It didn't bring the caste system just as the Muslims didn't, just as the Brits didn't. Caste is an ancient institution in India with its own history. It was not yet fully formed at the time of the Buddha, but in Germany it was already there. And the Buddha was a part of it, and indeed a beneficiary of it. You know, you could hardly go as far as the Buddha went simply by the place he was born in. So he didn't think of changing it. Okay then, thank you.